All right, welcome back to the Just Win podcast. It's been a while since we've started a pod or been on a pod. Sean Reed's been on a mysterious vacation in Europe for weeks now. One of those vacations where you post a picture of like a hand or a knee, but not the other person, and then he comes back and the first song he posts is "Crazy in Love." So, um, yeah, how was vacation? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing?
I was by myself actually, so to debunk your theory, it was actually not a vacation, but yeah, I was in Europe for 2 weeks, much to the chagrin of our subscribers at the Athletic. I got so many comments about where are you at? Subscribing, we're paying for this. Like guys, we take vacations too, So took a little break. Went to London, Barcelona, Lisbon, Porto, Paris, back to London. Went to the Wireless Festival over there. And then went up to Vancouver this past weekend over in Canada. So I've been on like a little bit of a world tour. Needed a little recharge. I know you're not talking. You went to I can't even remember where you went to. It was so fancy. Okay, what was it?
I went to Bali for a destination wedding and then Cancun, but
Yeah,
I'm all traveled out. We got our travels in for the off season, that's for sure. Yeah,
yeah. Now we
but
just got the in season travel on the way.
exactly. We're back. Training camp is starting this week. Pete Carroll talked today. We'll go through some of the things that he talked about. We'll go through training camp storylines, camp battles, and I'll be there at the Raiders Niners joint practices. By the way, so that'll be pretty cool. That's next week, I believe, or 2 weeks from now.
Couple weeks. Yeah, so I have to do an in person pod. I guess figure out a way to
Yeah,
set that up.
maybe we'll get a special guest, Vic Tafer, to join us on that podcast. Um, But yeah, let's talk about the Raiders just signed a few players. They signed safety Jamal Adams, who played for Pete Carroll, cornerback JT Woods, who was actually a converted safety to cornerback, and guard Antonio Mafi. Any takes on those guys?
Yeah, I think the Jamal Adams signing was a little surprising. Just given looking at their roster, like they definitely have some areas that would stand out as needs, but I didn't really think safety would be one. I think they're pretty confident in that starting duo of Jeremy Chin, who they just signed earlier this offseason, and Isaiah Pulumau, who kind of started out at necessity last year, but I think he was still pretty solid, all things considered, in that free safety role. And Jamal Adams obviously has that connection to Pete Carroll, played for him for years with the Seattle Seahawks, but he's had a rough go of it the last few years, bounced around the league. This is his third different team since 2024. He lost a lot of that, sort of special, ability that made him, an all pro player earlier in his career. His body just hasn't been able to hold up. And at this point, he's more of a box safety, only. I would say if you want to use him in the best way, kind of almost as a lighter linebacker who can also blitz off the edge. And Jeremy Chin can do a lot of that stuff, and so that's what makes me think this is more of sort of like a third safety sort of signing, a guy that as Chin moves around, whether he's coming down the nickel back or if he is lined up in the box or he's lined up deep, kind of have Adams who can fill in there when he's not in those different spots. If he is able to, perform throughout training camp and make the team ultimately. But at first, it kind of surprised me, but I think the more I thought about it, it kind of makes more sense.
Yeah, and he's dealt with a ton of injury issues going back to his time in Seattle. Barely played his last two seasons in Seattle. Barely played last year, where he was on Tennessee roster, Detroit roster. So he's had some time off and some time to let his body heal. And I think the bet is that maybe there is some upside here if he's healthy. Maybe we see a little, probably not that all pro type of player that we saw with Jamal Adams, but maybe he can be a starter. So there's some upside here. I'm sure the contract that they gave him was a non-guaranteed contract, and I think it's a worthwhile flyer to take. JT Woods was a guy I liked coming out of the draft. His biggest issue was tackling, because he was a safety, and he just did not tackle very well or good enough to play that position. I think he tried to play cornerback for the Seahawks last year. And obviously they kind of gave up on that experiment. And I would assume that he's also going to try out at cornerback for the Raiders. I don't know if they said anything about that yet.
No, they haven't officially announced it yet, but Like you said, he signed with the Seahawks with like a futures reserves contract like this offseason actually, and was with them during OTAs, but they cut him after. And he's a guy that, I mean, you look at his physical traits, you can see that the Carroll, why Carroll would be interested in him. I mean, he's 6'2", 195, ran a 4.3 at the combine, 40-inch verticals. So he's, tall, long, and fast. But like you said, he kind of struggled to stay on the field his first couple years with the Chargers, and also just couldn't really find a place in the rotation, starting off as a safety and then moving to corner. I actually think, looking at the roster, like if he, and I don't know if he's ever done this before. I haven't dug that deep into his past yet, but nickelback could be a spot where, if
Yeah.
he's able to make that transition, I think that's his best shot to make the team because they still don't really have a good full time answer there. I mean, Darnell Holmes would probably be the starter at nickelback if the season started today, but Woods with those physical traits, like if he can improve on that tackling piece, as there's obviously a huge role as a nickelback, like you almost are a third linebacker on the field when you're in there, so you can't be a liability as a tackler and be a starting nickelback on this defense. But I think if he can transition to that spot, I think that's probably where it makes the most sense for him to try to give it a go.
Yeah, I think tackling would be an issue at nickel, but maybe he's gotten a little bit bigger, or maybe he's worked on tackling and being a little bit more physical. Um, I could see him trying out an outside corner too. Like you said, he has that profile that Pete loves at outside corner. So we'll see. But I don't know too much about Antonio Maffi, but imagine he just adds a little bit of depth to that offensive line.
Yeah, he started like 5 games for the Patriots a couple years ago, but had a rough training camp last year and got cut and got picked up, in a practice squad deal with the Colts, but he didn't really play then either. And so, like you said, it's more of a depth signing. He's a guy that has a little bit of center flexibility, and so maybe if he can, compete for that backup center spot behind Jackson Powers Johnson, he can get in the mix. But they have a pretty big log jam there at guard, between Alice Kappa and Dylan Parham, Jordan Meredith. Thayer Munford get involved there, the rookie that he's drafted as well. So it's kind of hard pressed to see that guy probably making the roster, but probably more of a training camp body, and maybe he ends up finding a way on the practice squad.
Yeah, it is interesting that the Raiders haven't added a veteran corner. There are some older corners out there that could help, like Stephon Gilmore and Rasul Douglas. But I thought Robert Mays made a pretty interesting point on his podcast with those guys, because if you bring those guys in, those guys are going to take a lot of reps. So I think as of right now, they want those young guys like Darian Porter to get those repetitions in training camp. And if they do decide, okay, maybe these guys are a little further behind than we thought, then maybe you kind of go to that break glass of emergency veteran corner that doesn't offer a ton of upside, but at least gives you a little bit of a floor. Because right now there's upside in that DB room, but right now it could be a very low floor at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you have, Eric Stokes in there as a veteran guy who's been around for a while that maybe gives you that cushion if some of the young guys like Darian Porter or even a guy coming off an injury like Jacorian Bennett, if they're not back in the form yet. So I think that they're pretty comfortable with the group they have, and rolling with those guys. And I mean, being realistic, like, and I know Pete Carroll will get into what he talked about today, but one of the things he said was, I mean, he expects them to win a lot of games, and he's, won 10 plus games every year pretty much for the last 20 years. But, this team is it has some room to grow, like they need some time to develop and, become a team that can compete for the division, let alone, for the conference. And so um, I think they're okay with taking their lumps, for lack of a better phrase, at some of these positions. And so if you have a Darian Porter and he has kind of a rough first half of the season, but comes on strong in the second half of the season, and you maybe lose some games that you would have won if you had Stephon Gilmore, I think they're okay with that in the long run. Like obviously they hope he hits the ground running from day one and is a great player, but realistically, when you're playing as many young guys as the Raiders are going to be playing this year with the way the roster is, like you're going to have to endure some of those growing pains.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting build because it's not a rebuild. I don't think they're going quite all in, but it's about laying the foundation. And some of those foundational pieces don't have to be, like a rookie quarterback or whatnot. There's a little bit of a veteran presence when it comes to that foundation. But I think it's all about trying to get this team back to respectability. And like you mentioned, Pete wants to win those games. But the moves there's some moves that they've made or haven't made where it just seems like they're not quite in that all in mode that that I think they want to kind of express that they're in. But a big piece of competing next year is Christian Wilkins, and we've talked about him a lot during this offseason. Looks like he's off the boot in some recent videos and pictures, but he Pete Carroll just said that his timeline still remains uncertain.
Yeah, so it's really unclear, when he's going to be back, and I think a lot of people reacted to Pete saying that. I think part of it is like you don't want to put a set time on it, and then if it's 2 weeks later and you're still not there, then you've added pressure to the situation, and people are asking, "Oh, did some other setback happen?" And so just leaving it open ended, even if he has made progress since OTAs, is probably the best way to do it. But it's been a weird offseason for him. He's been in and out of that boot, like you said. Receiver to Alex Bachman posted a video over the weekend of them working out at the facility, and he didn't have the boot on there. I mean, I don't want to draw too much for him. We didn't see him run or move or anything like that to be able to evaluate really how that foot is feeling. And so right now he's on the pup list, physically unable to perform list. And the way that works is it really doesn't have much of an impact during training camp, but if he's still on that list once the season starts past cut down day, then he'll be forced to miss the first 4 games of the season. And then after that, they have like a 5 week window where they can activate him. And if they don't, then he'll be out for a year. And so um, we'll see. It could be possible that he's off that pup list before the season starts. It could drag into the season. But if he, at any point, if he returns to practice or plays in a game, he can't go back on the pup list. And so, that's part of probably why they put him on there to be cautious and give himself some time to ramp him back up. But like you said, I mean, it's a pretty huge story. I would say arguably the biggest story for them going into training camp is just what is his status, and it's I mean they need him really badly with his defense. I mean they signed him obviously to be a disruptive force on the inside and pair him up with Max Crosby, and we never really got to see that materialize outside of those 5 games last season. But they committed to him in a big way. Like there is no real moving on from Christian Wilkins until probably 2027 at the earliest. So even if this goes poorly and he doesn't play a game this season, like to cut him next year, they'd have to incur some pretty crazy dead money hits. And so if this goes bad, it's going to be something that really hampers the team for years to come. And so they really need to get him back healthy in a major way.
Yeah, and it's a shame because in the time that he played, he looked like one of those free agent signings that almost exceeded expectations. He was playing so well. I thought he was really blossoming into one of the top defensive tackles. He was kind of headed that direction, Miami, and just how disruptive he was and the impact he made on the field. It just sucks that he had this kind of setback on a celebration, and um, I think I'm not quite in panic mode quite yet with Christian Wilkins, but I think ideally he would have been ready to go in training camp. So I think we're headed towards kind of yellow to almost to red territory, but not quite there yet. We'll see how he is in a couple weeks, but I think if he's still not practicing in a couple weeks, this is a thing that is probably going to bleed into the season.
And I will say one thing on how he got injured. I know a lot of people have like been like jumping on Adam Butler for like the celebration thing, but that's actually not how he got hurt. He got hurt. It was like a play in a space. I forget who it was that caught the ball or was running the ball, but he was trying to make a cut to tackle somebody, and you can see him as soon as he
Mm.
does it, he starts hobbling. And he finished the first half, but didn't come back after that. So that's actually how he got hurt. It was a football play. It wasn't because he was celebrating a sack or whatever. Which also like even if it was, like, you want guys never to celebrate because they might possibly be injured. So,
Hey,
anyway, this has been a thing that fans have
The
been
Raiders have had some
running with.
bad luck with, celebrations, and things that have to do with celebrations, right? There's the
Yeah.
Khalil Mack celebration, there's the celebration after, they beat the Chiefs that ended up pissing them off. Celebrations haven't been kind to the Raiders lately, okay? But it's good that Wilkins wasn't hurt on a celebration. But anyways, let's get into, the biggest storylines heading to camp. I know you wrote a story for the Athletic about it. So let's run through some of the big stories that we need to talk about.
Yes, I mean, obviously, Wilkins is a big one. We kind of already recapped that. The other part of that is, if he does miss time, there's a big question mark of like who else is going to step up at defensive tackle, right? Because I think Adam Butler, we know what he is as a starter. He's played pretty well for them the last couple of years. Brings a lot of pass rush juice on the inside, but outside of that, they don't really have anybody else who's proven anything. A couple of veterans and Zach Carter and Lecky Fotu were the guys who, got most of the reps during OTAs, but they haven't really been difference makers at any point throughout their careers. They have a couple young guys, a few young guys in Jonah Lulu and Tonka Hemingway and JJ Pegues, but we haven't really seen much out of those guys so far. And so I think with Wilkins being out, like obviously they want him out there on the field, but since he's not there, they'll be able to decipher, is there somebody else amongst this group who's ready to step up right now? And if not, I think that could be a position maybe at the end of training camp, maybe where you're looking around and seeing, is there a veteran free agent that can come in and help us in a pinch here, if you're the Raiders in that situation. So I think once these practices start and we actually see pads come on, because that was the other thing in OTAs, like, I mean, it's padless practices. Like you can't really evaluate offensive or defensive linemen very much. And so now we're going to start seeing these guys working in pads and really see what they're all about. Kind of looking ahead of the season.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with the guy like Wilkins, you need multiple players to really replace his impact because, those some question his ceiling as a pass rusher. There is no questioning that he was elite against a run. So you'd really need to find a defensive tackle that could hold up against a run and be disruptive against the run on early downs. And then later on, when you get into third down and those long yardage situations, you could, have Tyree Wilson rush from the inside. I think Pegus I think he's really interesting. I mean, like I didn't really watch his film until after the draft, but man, he had some good games, and he's a very athletic um, defensive lineman with a nice repertoire of moves. So I think he could be a guy that is useful on those long yardage situations. But yeah, you're gonna need multiple players to really replace Wilkins, especially if he misses some games.
I think after that, I mean, for me, the offensive line is a big one. Can this unit be one that's dependent on? And, I know we talked about it earlier this offseason. Kind of we landed on, we think this could probably be a below average to average unit, just given that they didn't really add much to the group coming off of last season. But I think this is really going to be, the biggest question for the offense. They obviously made an upgrade at quarterback in Geno Smith. I would say they made another huge upgrade at running back in Ashton Genty. You could say they improved their skill talent as well, but it's going to be hard to have much consistent success on offense if that offensive line is as bad as it was last year. I mean, like they were historically bad when it came to run blocking, and they weren't good when it came to pass protection either. And so I think that's really the biggest question for this offense is can the O line be dependent on?
Yeah, I think Colton Miller is going to be very good, like he always has been. We've talked about, he started the season slow last year, and then he really picked up his play as he got healthier. Um, and Jackson Powers Johnson, I think a lot depends on him and taking that leap, not only to be a serviceable starter or a good starter. He has. We talked about it with Brandon Thorne. He has the ability to be a top 10 type of center. So the Raiders are hoping he takes that huge leap into that territory. And there's a lot riding on DJ Glaze, and the Raiders have put a lot of faith in him, not really trying to upgrade at that position because they have faith that he can make a leap. And I don't think his ceiling is quite as high as Jackson Powers Johnson is at his position, but if he could be a plus starter or an average 2+ starter, that's going to be a huge boost for the Raiders. And then you have the competition inside. And we'll see if Alex Kappa could bounce back from a really bad season where he dealt with a lot of injuries. I think facing the Niners will be a pretty good test. The Niners they don't have that star-studded defensive line that they've had in the past, but they still have Nick Bosa. They have Micah Williams, first-round pick, and some young players to come in. So I think it's a good starting battle for them, and you could kind of tell where they're at. They should be able to play well against that defensive line, but if they struggle against that defensive line in joint practices, that's going to tell you a lot.
Yeah. And I think, you know, kind of the next bucket that I got into in the story was, and we talked about it, but, will this bet that they're making on youth pay off? Because, they only have 6 players on the roster who are 30 years old or older. So it's a really young team. It's one of the youngest teams in the league. I think they're fifth or sixth the last time I checked. So they might have changed today with all these veterans they're signing. We'll see. But yeah, they didn't really max out that cap space. Like you mentioned earlier, they didn't really go all in, like we said. I mean, they still had over $30 million in cap space before these signings that they just made, and so they're really banking on this young talent. to be able to develop into something special down the road. And it's clearly not just about this season, right? Like you're trying to get these guys experience so you can see if they can help you in year 2 and year 3 of this regime. And so you're going to take some lumps along the way. They're probably not going to be, really a playoff team this year in all likelihood, but if you can get a strong foundation of young guys that are on cheap rookie control contracts, that can go a long way towards having sustained success moving into the future.
Yeah, and it's good to realize where you're at. I think that was a problem with the last couple of regimes, as far as just kind of overestimating where the Raiders could be. They like we mentioned, there's the foundation. It's not just a all rookies, all first, second year players type of foundation. It's a veteran. There's a veteran leadership in that foundation, but there's also a lot of young players. So this year's it's going to be about setting that standard, getting this team into a place where they can compete and getting those young guys experience. And obviously Pete Carroll wants to win. He expressed that today. We'll see how far those young guys can develop. But it just isn't all in type of roster that we've kind of seen with the Raiders in the past. That's kind of hurt them long term.
And one more note on the veteran front, they also signed receiver Philip Dorsett, um, according to reports. He actually was on the Raiders back in 2023. He got signed in off season, and he didn't end up making the roster. So see if he make it this time around. But older guy in his 30s, a veteran. So we'll see who he's able to add to the mix.
All right, what's the next storyline we got to talk about?
Um, what I have to focus on was, will they extend Jacoby Myers or Colton Miller? Both of those guys going into the final year of their contracts. They'll be free agents next season if they don't get deals done. And Miller, he briefly had sort of that holdout situation OTAs before he ended up coming back. And I think with him, the big thing is just, is he going to be able to get back to being himself healthy for an entire season? He had that shoulder injury really sort of derailed his 2023 season. I think because of that injury last season, he really wasn't quite himself for probably about half of the year. And so they may want to see, can he return to form, for a full season and look like Colton Miller again before they sign him to a big extension. Because I mean, he's not even 30 years old yet. He's played at a high level in the past. So really, the only reason not to extend him at this point is if you have some questions about his long term viability. Whereas with Jacoby Myers, I think it's more of a matter of like, I think they might have already drafted his replacement in Jack Besh. Like I don't think their skill sets really fit being on the field at the same time together that much. Like Besh is a guy that he really thrived the most in the slot, I would say, during college. And Myers spent a lot of time in the slot during OTAs and throughout his career, he spent a lot of time in the slot. And when you also have Mark Bowers spending a lot of time in the slot, and you have these outside receivers like a Dante Thornton who, has more of that traditional build and speed combo that you want to see to win on the outside. It's kind of hard to find a spot where Besh fits in, to get a lot of reps this year. And so I think, if you want to give him a year to kind of learn and develop behind Myers and then turn the page to Besh next year, that's probably the main reason why you don't extend Myers. Because I think, again, like he's a guy that he's 28 years old. He's coming off the best season of his career. He has sure hands. Not only is he a really good inside outside receiver, he's a strong run blocker. He's a leader in the locker room. So you can't really identify a bunch of reasons not to, extend him unless there is some sort of larger succession plan in the works. And so we'll see. We still got a little bit over a month before the season gets here, see if either one of these guys gets a new deal. But I think that is something to monitor.
Yeah, I think with Max Crosby, they got ahead of it and they signed him to a large extension, and it ended up being probably one of the better moves of the offseason because we see all these other huge extensions like with TJ Watt, and they were able to avoid having to outbid those guys, kind of like what Jerry Jones has to go through with Michael Parsons, but that's a whole nother conversation that we don't need to get into. But I think with Max Crosby, he's a no brainer type of player, and like you mentioned, with Miller, he is getting a little bit older. But to me, I think Miller is a guy that you do sign. I think he's just been so solid for his career. Left tackles of that quality are hard to find. I also think that he's a player that is athletic enough to where he will age pretty gracefully. I guess the only questions is yeah, if his body will hold up. Jacoby Myers, I could see as being a little difficult because although he's a very, very good number two receiver, borderline number one receiver, like how much are you willing to pay those guys that aren't like that elite tier of wide receiver, and how much of the cap do you spend on those guys, especially when, yeah, like you mentioned, they drafted a guy that could end up being his replacement in Jack Besh. I mean, obviously, we don't know how good Besh is quite yet, but he's a guy that they clearly like drafting him in the second round.
Yeah, yeah, and I think obviously it would be pretty annoying for fans, like, if he doesn't play much in year 1 as a second round pick, especially considering they had a bunch of needs elsewhere. But, that could just end up being how it falls because it was mostly Thornton and then Trey Tucker working on the outside during OTAs, and a lot can change, like, he could, have a great training camp and lock up one of those starting spots, but right now he's playing catch up for sure. Um, the last one I had was, really just sort of asking, like, what's the ceiling for Geno Smith in the offense? Um and we talked about it, like he's probably the biggest upgrade a quarterback any team made this offseason. They added Ashton Genty, made a coordinator change to Chip Kelly. But what is realistically like how good could this unit really be? Like this offense has been stuck in a rut the last few years, ever since they got rid of Derek Carr. It's been a really rough go for them at quarterback and the offense as a whole. So, is this a unit that could be top 15? Is it still one of the 10 worst units in the league because the offensive line can't block and Chip Kelly hasn't adjusted well to the NFL? So I think it'd be interesting to see like just how good can this offense be with where things stand and kind of the question marks that we have about the offensive line and even the receiver depth.
Yeah, it is interesting. I listen to a lot of national podcasts, and everybody's listing the Raiders as like this interesting team. They're not quite ready to say that they're getting past that hump, but a lot of the intrigue and optimism is around the upgrade that Geno Smith does provide. And as you guys know, I'm a big Geno Smith believer. I really believe he can play like a top 10 quarterback if he gets protection, which he did not get in Seattle. He did not have a run game in Seattle. He had two offense coordinators that ended up getting fired, so he didn't have good play callers. So I think theoretically, Chip Kelly can be a good play caller. Theoretically, this line can be at least average, and theoretically, adding Ashton Genty, they could have a running game. So we'll see if those things play out. I think there's enough weapons here with the Raiders to where they can support him from a perspective of pass catching, but play calling and protection is what's really going to set the ceiling for this team. I think Geno Smith to me isn't a question mark.
Yeah, I'd agree there.
All right, so let's talk about camp battles.
Yeah, so I think a way we could do this is we kind of can both highlight what we think are the five biggest position battles of
Okay.
training camp. Kind of you go, I go, and then we see if we agree or not.
Okay. I'll go. I think the biggest battle is going to be at cornerback. I think cornerback is the biggest question mark on this team. I think, and right now the two starters, and it's not really they didn't really don't really have a depth chart yet, but the guys getting a lot of first team reps are Eric Stokes and Darian Porter. We know Darian Porter is a developmental type of guy that has a ton of ability, but just not a lot of experience at the position, and he's going to be asked to play one of the hardest positions in football in the NFL. And Eric Stokes is a guy who has some draft pedigree, but just hasn't worked out in Green Bay, and he's kind of a reclamation project. And anytime you have two projects at corner, it's a bit rough. And then you have Jacorian Bennett, who played really well until he was injured last year too. Some questions at nickel. I think Jeremy Chin ends up playing a lot of nickel for this team. So we'll see how it plays out. But to me, I don't think one of those guys will end up being on the bench. I think Jacorian Bennett ends up taking one of those starting spots. So we'll see who ends up being the top two corners for this team.
Yeah, yeah, I have had that on my list as well, of course. And I think it probably ends up being Darian Porter and Jacorian Bennett. I think Bennett, I mean, he was pretty excellent last season when he was healthy, and even in OTAs, I think he was probably made the most plays on the ball that I saw of any quarterback that's in that group. And so, I think it's really just about him getting back fully healthy and kind of securing that starting spot again. But that's definitely going to be one to watch. And now you have JT Woods getting in the mix there as well, and Cameron Richardson still around. And like I said earlier, it'll be interesting to see like do any of these guys, show move over to nickelback and show what they can do there because I think that's one of the biggest needs on the roster at this point.
Yeah, and there's also always a possibility that they sign one of these older corners that's available on the market too, if they think that some of these young guys aren't ready at corner yet.
Yeah. So I guess another position battle that be looking for is receiver. And we got into it just talking about the Myers potential extension, but there's kind of gonna be that three-man race between Besh, Thornton, and then Tucker to see who fits in on the outside there. Those last two spots besides Myers and Thornton was the most impressive of that group during OTAs. I mean, just his physical traits, it's not surprising. I mean, he's 6'4", strong guy, fast. It's really just about expanding his route tree. But you saw him making plays pretty much every other practice during OTAs, and Trey Tucker even made a few nice catches as well, especially on deep balls, and he has that dynamic speed. And so for Besh, it's sort of what's his way of winning on the outside, right? Like he's not a guy that's a blazer. He's not particularly big. So it's gonna have to be route running. It's gonna have to be skill based. His releases, getting off the line of scrimmage, beating press coverage at the line of scrimmage, and so seeing if he can do that and carve out a role as a starter, I think is going to be something to keep an eye on throughout training camp.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise me if there's a very active rotation at receiver. Like, Dante Thornton provides the speed that they need because this offense is kind of really compact, like you mentioned, with the guys at the slot, and just needing a guy to take the top off the defense. With Trey Tucker could do the same thing. So I could see them playing a role that way, and maybe when they want to run the ball a little bit more, getting Besh, which would give them another really good perimeter blocker on the field at the same time. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see who plays more or what personnel packages they feel a little bit more comfortable in, and that's going to be something they work out in camp. The next position I think is going to be at guard, both guard spots. Obviously Alex Kappa and Parham seem to have the edge right now, but there's some guys that could potentially get above them in on the depth chart if they have a good camp. Uh, they have I'm blanking on his name right now. The guy they drafted in the third round,
Oh,
Rogers.
yeah, Caleb Rogers.
Yeah, Caleb Rogers. We don't know, what he is quite yet until the pads are on and they're actually hitting. So and there's Jordan Meredith who played well in spots for the Raiders last year. Pete's things is all about competition, so I think it's going to be a legit competition at those guard spots.
Yeah, I think it's been more rotation at left guard throughout OTAs, but um, Kappa's been pretty penciled in as a starter at right guard. But we'll see. Like if he has a rough training camp, he could get bumped over too. I think we saw Caleb Rogers working a little bit more on the right side compared to those other guys working on the left side. I saw him rotate in behind Kappa a few times with the starters toward the end of camp. So yeah, we'll see how that group shakes out. I kind of hit on it already with the cornerback group, but I think nickelback is really a huge one. Darnay Holmes will be the starter right now, but Jeremy Chin, he's a guy that rotated down to nickelback a lot from safety during OTAs, and I think that's something he's done in the past with his career. Like you go and look at his tape from the Washington Commanders last year. He spent a lot of time at nickelback, so that's not new for him. But I think that's probably part of the reason why you see the Jamal Adams signing. Like I said earlier, is if you do have Chin rotate down to nickelback in certain situations, now you have a guy that can fill in for him at safety. Um, but I still think like just when you do want to go to like a true nickel package with your defense, like I think you need a better option, frankly. So we'll see if one of those guys emerges from somebody that's already on the roster, if it's JT Woods, if it's Thomas Harper or somebody else that gets into the mix, or if they maybe turn to the veteran market at some point.
Yeah, there's no real true nickel on this team, so they're trying to find like interesting solutions to fill that nickel spot. So we'll see what ends up happening there. Well, is that five spots? We talk about five spots.
Those four. So
Four? Okay. And the fifth we kind of talked about, but defensive tackle, who's going to be those guys that fill out the rotation and really replace Christian Wilkins, a guy that can replace him on early downs, and who's going to be that strong interior rusher on long yardage situations.
yeah, I mean, ideally those young guys step up, right? Like the Goose and Hemingway and Laulu. It's kind of hard to say I could evaluate any of those guys off of OTAs without them getting pads on, but saw Laulu get into the mix towards the end of the season last year, and so. Like you said, it's not going to be one guy that just suddenly becomes the Christian Wilkins replacement. It's going to have to be a mix of guys, and so we'll see how that conversation heats up once we get into camp, and now, just also how long is Christian Wilkins really out, and but yeah. So I guess one more thing we can do, just because the NFL just published the transactions wire, so we actually have like the full list of everything that happened today. All right. So the Raiders, they signed 5 players. They signed Jamal Adams, JT Woods, guard Antonio Maffey, receivers Philip Dorsett and Seth Williams. And then they waived cornerback Melo Dotson, receivers Zachary Franklin, Keyshawn Smith, another receiver, and then linebacker Jalen Walker. So they basically waived a collection of UDFA guys that they signed earlier this offseason in order to bring in some more veterans there. So got a little less young today, some more veteran guys. And so, yeah, they have some different faces out there when they get practice going tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think that's typically how it happens too. You kind of see what these young guys have, and then you try to bring in some veteran guys that could provide some real depth on this team. And we talked about most of these signings are early in the podcast, so if you haven't watched that, check out the replay. We talk about them a little bit more in depth. But before we get into questions, I want to just remind you guys that we'll be on a more set cadence as far as our podcast now that Tashan is back from his magical European adventure. We'll probably be recording every Tuesday, at least once a week, and maybe if something happens in camp, twice a week. And there'll be joint practices in a few weeks, and we'll get special guest Vic Tafer when the Niners play practice with the Raiders during that time. All right, let's get into questions. I don't see a ton of questions, so if you have a question, go ahead and add that onto the list. Did you get any questions from Twitter?
No, I don't. There's people just been reacting to the signings, asking us to break those down, which obviously we did. Obviously, it's a little bit quiet. Otherwise, the day before camp, where everybody just kind of wants practices to start. We had a question here from Space Beast. He asked, "When do you watch your first practice?" So they practice tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. Then they take Saturday off, and then they practice again Sunday, and then schedule continues on throughout the rest of the next few weeks. Like Ted said, they do have that joint practice session with the 49ers. This is one day, so it's not like a multi-day joint practice session like they've done in years past. Their first preseason game is against the Seahawks up in Seattle, so it'll be a nice little reunion with Pete Carroll and Jamal Adams and them up there. I'm kind of surprised they didn't do joint practices with them, honestly. But historically, Pete Carroll does not like joint practices, so I guess that little one-day 49ers joint practice would be enough for them. But yeah, I mean, if nobody else has any questions, I guess we can wrap it up.
I've got one more by Shock Bowers. Are you getting a third person to join you now that Vic is off doing other things? Vic is covering the Niners, and we don't have a plan to bring on a third member quite yet. So yeah, it'll be just us two covering the Raiders throughout the season. But we're planning to get more guests on, like Raider players and coaches and things like that. So be on the lookout for that. But it doesn't look like we have a ton of questions today. But it's good to be back. Training camp is getting started. We're going to see some real football soon. And we're going to get these, training camp highlights going. But be careful. A new trend now is a bunch of people are just posting like 4-year-old training camp highlights and passing it off as current highlights. And ESPN got fooled into posting one today. So be careful of that. But yeah, we will join you guys. We'll talk to you guys soon, probably next Tuesday. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, have a good week.
All right, y'all. Peace.